The world before the rain began. To understand what happened during the 40 days of rain, one must first comprehend the world that existed before them. The Bible describes a scene of profound moral corruption, where human wickedness had reached a level never seen since creation. Genesis reports that every thought and purpose of the human heart was continuously evil, a devastating statement that reveals the spiritual condition of that generation. It was not merely isolated sins here and there, but a systemic and widespread condition that had overtaken the entire known civilization. God looked upon the earth and found not only sin, but a distortion so deep of the created order that destruction became not merely a punishment, but a necessity for a new beginning. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of a completely different one. Noah lived in this world and was described as a righteous and blameless man among his generation, someone who walked with God in the midst of the chaos around him. For decades, and according to some traditions, for more than 100 years, he had worked on building the ark, likely being a subject of mockery and disbelief by his contemporaries. No rain had ever fallen upon the earth the way it was about to fall, and many biblical scholars believe that the hydrological system of the ancient world functioned in a completely different way than today. The earth was irrigated by mist and by underground waters, and the idea of a storm capable of submerging the entire world was something beyond the imagination of anyone alive at that time. Noah preached righteousness, but no one listened, and now the deadline had come to an end. 7 days before the rain began, God commanded Noah to enter the ark together with his family and the animals. This 7-day period was a kind of final window, one last moment of grace before the doors would close definitively on the outside world. The Bible does not describe what happened during those 7 days outside the ark, but we can imagine that life continued normally for everyone else, without any visible sign that something extraordinary was about to happen. Jesus himself described this period when speaking of his return, saying that people were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. Normality was, paradoxically, the perfect backdrop for the most extraordinary event in human history. 7 days of silent waiting inside the ark, while the world outside had no idea what was coming. Inside the ark, the atmosphere was certainly one of expectation and tension, mixed with faith. Noah and his family, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with their wives, totaled 8 people who carried on their shoulders the entire responsibility of preserving life on earth. The animals were already aboard, the provisions were stored, and the wooden structure impregnated with pitch awaited the moment when it would become the only vessel upon the waters of the entire world. We do not know what each family member thought or felt during those 7 days of waiting, but it is hard to imagine they slept peacefully without the weight of that moment pressing upon them. Faith and fear, certainty and uncertainty probably coexisted inside that wooden ark with the same intensity as the animals that inhabited it. The biblical text in Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 marks the beginning of the flood with impressive precision, recording that it was in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, that the floodgates of the heavens opened. This chronological specificity is remarkable for an ancient text and suggests that the event was treated with the seriousness of a real historical record, not a vague legend. The Hebrew calendar used as reference has been the subject of intense study by theologians and chronologists who attempt to establish an absolute date for the beginning of the flood within human history. Regardless of the exact date, What the text makes clear is that there was a precise marking of the moment, as if the cosmos itself had recorded that instant as a literal and figurative watershed in the history of humanity. It's important to note that the flood was not merely ordinary rain falling continuously for 40 days. The biblical text describes two distinct mechanisms that operated simultaneously to produce the extraordinary volume of water needed to cover all the earth. The floodgates of the heavens opened, an expression suggesting rain of incomprehensible intensity and volume for normal human experience, and the fountains of the great deep burst forth, indicating that water also gushed from within the earth itself. This combination of water coming from above and below simultaneously points to a catastrophic event of geological and atmospheric proportions without precedent in recorded history. Before it began, the ancient world was already condemned by its own moral state, but now the physical mechanism of destruction had been activated, and nothing could stop it. The day the rain began, on the 17th day of the second month, the silence of the ancient world was torn apart by something no human being had ever experienced before. The first drops probably fell with unusual violence, different from any rain that generation could have known, assuming any form of precipitation had previously existed in that format. The sky, which had previously served as a protective veil, holding back the waters above it, as described in the creation account, now opened as if the gates of a colossal dam had been released. At the same time, the earth trembled as the fountains of the great deep burst open, releasing underground waters with a force that may have resembled volcanic eruptions or earthquakes combined with jets of water. For those who were outside, that first day of rain must have been simply terrifying, with no frame of reference to process what was happening. The biblical text does not describe the reactions of the people who remained outside the ark, but logic and imagination lead us to some probable scenarios. At first, many may have sought shelter in their homes, expecting the storm to pass like any other. As the hours went on, and the intensity did not diminish, panic certainly began to set in. Streets and fields began to accumulate water rapidly, rivers overflowed, and the lowest points of the terrain were the first to be submerged. On that first day, people from higher regions still had some time, but those living in valleys and plains already faced emergency situations. The race to higher ground began immediately, and the instinct for survival replaced any rationality or collective organization. Inside the ark, the first day of rain was at the same time a moment of confirmation and horror. Noah and his family heard the flood begin and knew that everything God had said was real and happening exactly as foretold. The confirmation of the divine word, however, came accompanied by the devastating awareness that every human being outside those wooden walls was now condemned. It is impossible not to imagine that Noah thought of friends, neighbors, acquaintances, perhaps relatives who had refused to enter the ark. The door had been closed by God himself, according to the biblical text, which means that not even Noah had the power to open it again to save anyone else. That enclosure was simultaneously protection and emotional prison. The movement of the ark on the first day of rain must have been something surprising for all on board. A structure so large, built with wood and pitch, was designed not to navigate but to float, and when the waters began to rise around it, it probably moved in a slow and heavy manner as it lifted off the ground where it had been built. The initial rocking, the sounds of wood settling under the pressure of water, the deafening noise of rain on the roof, and the sounds of animals reacting to the changing environment must have created a symphony of chaos that no family member could have completely imagined beforehand. Noah had likely spent years thinking about building the ark, but living inside it in motion was a completely different experience from anything he had anticipated. The fountains of the great deep that burst open on the first day represent perhaps the least discussed and most fascinating aspect of the biblical flood. Many scholars believe this refers to enormous pressurized underground reservoirs of water that existed in the Earth's crust and were released in a catastrophic manner. Some creationist geology researchers point to evidence of ancient massive aquifers and rock formations, suggesting large-scale hydrological activity in the Earth's geological past. If these fountains burst simultaneously with the intense rain on the first day, the combination would produce a rise in water levels far more rapid than any rain alone could cause. This would explain how the water level could rise so dramatically in a relatively short period. The first day was the beginning of a count that would last much longer than the 40 days of rain itself. Although the 40 days are the most famous period of the flood, they represented only the initial phase of a process that would extend for months. From the very first moment the rain began, the fate of the ancient world was sealed, and there was no human power, strategic escape, or supplication that could reverse what was happening. For Noah and his family, that first day marked the beginning of a journey without a map or precedent, in which faith would need to sustain 8 people through a period of tribulation lasting more than a full year. The first day was the shortest of a long and transformative passage through the chaos of the waters. The first 7 days, the rain intensifies. Just as the number 40 holds special significance in the biblical narrative, the number 7 also appears as an important marker in the flood account. 7 days before the rain began, God ordered the entry into the ark, and the first 7 days of the flood seem to have represented a phase of progressive establishment and intensification of the waters. There are no verse-by-verse details about what happened on each of these first days, but the logic of the event and the meteorological and geological knowledge available today allow us to imagine with reasonable accuracy what those days were like. The rain did not reach its peak immediately, just as any real storm begins with a certain progression before reaching its maximum intensity. On the second and third days, the waters covering the lowlands already made it impossible for millions of people to return to normalcy. Escape routes to elevated areas were being used desperately, and the social structure of that civilization likely began to collapse rapidly in the face of the existential threat. Social hierarchies, systems of exchange, agreements and contracts that kept society functioning lost all relevance in the face of the urgent need to find dry ground. The strong and powerful used their resources to climb higher, while the weak and vulnerable were left behind. The wickedness that had provoked the judgment continued to manifest even during the execution of that judgment. For the wild animals not on the ark, the first days of the flood represented the beginning of an instinctive and frantic search for higher ground. Elephants, lions, rhinoceroses, and all large creatures that depended on vast stretches of land for survival saw their habitats progressively disappear. Birds had a temporary advantage, being able to fly upward, but even they would need somewhere to land and rest. The fossil record that creationist researchers use in their arguments frequently shows patterns of burial suggesting a desperate flight of animals toward higher altitudes, which is consistent with the scenario of the first days of the flood. Inside the ark, the first days were probably the most difficult in terms of adaptation. 8 humans and hundreds or thousands of animals of different species needed to establish a routine that would work in that confined and moving space. The daily care of the animals, feeding, waste management, division of responsibilities among family members, all of this needed to be organized in a practical and functional manner from the very beginning. Noah, as the leader of that extraordinary mission, needed to maintain not only the physical order of the vessel, but also the emotional and spiritual state of his family. Leadership inside the ark certainly required of Noah a level of wisdom and presence that few leaders in history have been called to demonstrate. As the days passed and the rain showed no signs of diminishing, the people outside the ark who were still alive must have gone through progressive stages of despair. The initial hope that the storm would pass was replaced by the growing terror of realizing the water kept rising without stopping. Those who had found refuge on hills and mountains watched the waters rise over the days and realized with horror that even the altitudes that seemed safe at first would not be sufficient. The Bible describes that the waters eventually covered even the highest mountains by at least 15 cubits above them, and this process of progressively covering elevated lands happened over days and weeks. The first 7 days established the pattern of a destruction that would be total and without exceptions. No region escaped, no altitude was high enough, and no human technology of that era could have built anything that would resist or serve as an alternative to the ark. This initial period of the flood is one of the most dramatic in the narrative, because it was the moment when the ancient world understood it was facing something completely beyond its ability to control or comprehend. The generation that had rejected Noah and his message for decades now faced the consequences of a collective choice that had been made over generations. The first 7 days were the beginning of the end of one world, and at the same time, the first steps of a long journey of renewal. From the 2nd week to the 20th day, the submerged world. In the 2nd week of incessant rain, the world that had existed before the flood was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. The great civilized plains, where cities and villages had flourished, were now completely submerged, and only the tops of the tallest buildings or the most robust trees could serve as visual references for what had existed below. The rain continued falling with the same relentless intensity that had marked the first day, and the feeling that the very sky had transformed into an ocean pouring itself upon the earth was the only possible description for what the survivors still on dry land were experiencing. The sound of the rain must have been deafening, a constant and unpausing roar that made communication difficult and saturated the senses in a way that must have been psychologically devastating. The water currents that formed during this 2nd week were not simple floods. With so much water falling from above and gushing from below simultaneously, powerful currents formed and moved sediments, rocks, trees, and the remains of human constructions with tremendous force. Creationist geologists argue that it was exactly this kind of catastrophic movement of sediments that formed many of the geological layers we see today, including the deposits where fossils are found in abundance. The hydrodynamics of the floodwaters were not those of a tranquil lake that simply rose, but of a chaotic and violent hydrological system that reorganized the Earth's surface in ways we can still observe millennia later. Around the 15th day, it was likely that only the peaks of the highest mountains still stood above the waterline. People who had managed to climb to these extreme altitudes now found themselves in a completely desperate situation, without food, without adequate shelter to protect them from the relentless rain, and watching the waters continue to rise around them. The biblical text does not describe explicit scenes of horror, but the weight of the situation can be imagined by anyone who meditates seriously on what it meant to be a survivor outside the ark at that moment. There was nowhere to run, no help on the way, and the only certainty was the waters that continued to rise inexorably. Inside the ark, the 20th day of rain probably represented a period of some accommodation to the new reality. The daily routine of caring for the animals, dividing tasks, maintaining the vessel's structure, and sustaining the emotional cohesion of the family had established itself in some form. We should not romanticize this situation, for living in an enclosed space with a huge number of animals of different species, with the smell, noise, and constant need for management, was a physically and emotionally exhausting experience. The fact that 8 people managed to survive for months under these conditions without any record of serious conflict between them is in itself remarkable and can be attributed both to divine providence and to Noah's leadership. The progressive submersion of the world during this period also represented the irreversible destruction of all the cultural, technological, and historical memory of that civilization. Temples, palaces, written records, works of art, constructions that had taken generations to build, all were being destroyed and buried by the waters. If there was an advanced civilization before the flood, as some biblical interpretations suggest, based on the longevity of the antediluvians and the level of organization described in Genesis, then the flood represented a cultural loss of unimaginable proportions. The world that emerged after the flood was literally a world starting from zero, with only 8 human survivors carrying any memory of what had existed before. From the 20th to the 30th day, the rain continued, and the waters had certainly reached their maximum level, or were close to it. The biblical text tells us that the waters prevailed over the earth for 150 days, a period far greater than the 40 days of rain itself. This means that even when the rain ceased after 40 days, the waters remained at their maximum level for a long time before beginning to recede. Understanding this aspect is fundamental to comprehending the complete timeline of the flood, as the 40 days are only one part of a much longer story. The second and third weeks of rain were probably the most intense days in terms of the speed of water elevation, and it was during this period that the ancient world disappeared definitively beneath the waves. From the 21st to the 30th day, life inside the ark. With the outside world completely submerged and nothing left to be done except wait, the days inside the ark must have acquired an almost monastic quality, marked by repetition, forced inwardness, and total dependence on divine providence. There were no windows that could offer any comforting view, as what was outside was simply water in every direction and on every visible horizon. The only point of reference was the interior of the ark, its compartments, its animals, its sounds and smells, and the 8 people who shared that unique space in human history. The perception of time during these days probably shifted profoundly, with the days becoming difficult to distinguish from one another without the usual anchors of daily life that structure human temporal experience. Feeding and watering the animals inside the ark represented a logistical challenge of considerable proportions. The diversity of diets among animal species, the quantities of food needed for different sizes and metabolisms, and the proper storage of provisions for what would prove to be a very long period, required a highly efficient organizational system. Some scholars speculate that God may have caused many of the animals to enter a state of hibernation or torpor during the journey, which would dramatically reduce the feeding and management needs. This possibility aligns with the capacity God demonstrated throughout the Bible to use the natural laws themselves in extraordinary ways to accomplish his purposes, and would resolve many of the logistical objections frequently raised against the historicity of the account. The spiritual life of Noah and his family during this period is something about which the Bible does not give us explicit details, but upon which we can meditate deeply. Prayer was certainly a regular practice, and meditation on the divine promises that had led to the construction of the ark must have been a fundamental spiritual anchor for all on board. Noah had spent decades walking with God before the flood, and this intimate relationship with the Creator was the foundation upon which he and his family could lean during days of anguish and uncertainty inside the vessel. The faith that moves mountains is the faith that was built before the crisis, and the flood was the ultimate test of a faith that had been cultivated over a lifetime of obedience. Noah's sons and their wives, totaling 6 people, in addition to Noah himself and his wife, represented the diversity of temperaments, abilities, and ways of processing experience that any human group contains. It is inevitable that there were moments of tension, of fear expressed in different ways, of mourning for lost friends and acquaintances, and of questioning about the future. The Bible, with its characteristic honesty about human nature, does not present Noah and his family as superheroes without emotions, but as real human beings who were chosen for an extraordinary mission, without that making them immune to the fragilities inherent in the human condition. Surviving the flood was as much a spiritual feat as a psychological one of enormous magnitude. The animals inside the ark were also experiencing their own version of the flood, reacting to the unstable environment, the vibrations of rain on the roof, the constant movement of the vessel in the waters, and the presence of species that would normally be predators or prey to one another. The fact that predators and prey coexisted in the ark for months without the space turning into a chaos of violence and death is another aspect of the account that points to supernatural intervention. Just as the account of Daniel in the lion's den, the temporary domestication of predatory instinct in service of a greater divine purpose is part of a biblical pattern of God exercising authority over animal nature when it serves his redemptive purposes. Days 21 through 30 were also probably the quietest in terms of external drama. The destruction had been completed. The rain continued, but the worst of the flooding had already happened, and the daily life of the ark had found its rhythm. These intermediate days are perhaps the hardest to narrate in a dramatic way, but they are the most deeply human of the entire flood story. These were the days when Noah and his family were not reacting to an immediate crisis or celebrating a final victory, but simply living in faithfulness within their mission, day after day, without knowing exactly when or how that experience would end. These days of silent faithfulness are, in many respects, the spiritual heart of the entire flood narrative. From the 31st to the 40th day, the final days of rain. As the days approached the 40-day mark, the rain continued with the same persistence with which it had begun, and there was no external visible sign that it was about to cease. Inside the ark, Noah and his family did not have a calendar marking a countdown to the 40th day, for the number 40 was known to God, not to them. They lived in faith that the divine promise to preserve them would be fulfilled, but without the certainty of knowing when or how the end of the most acute phase of the flood would come. This is a fundamental detail that is often overlooked in discussions of the flood. Noah did not know it was day 38 or day 39. He woke each morning trusting that God would do what he had promised, without knowing the exact number of days that remained. The 35th day of rain represented, without Noah knowing it, the final 5 days of continuous precipitation before the rain ceased. The outside world, completely submerged, was undergoing radical geological transformations that shaped the face of the earth we know today. The moving water currents, the sediments in suspension, the erosive and depositional forces simultaneously at work on a global scale were sculpting valleys, mountains, plains, and canyons in ways that secular geology would attribute to the actions of processes over millions of years. The creationist perspective argues that what conventional geology distributes over vast geological ages can be explained by the catastrophic intensity of a global event, like the flood acting over a relatively short period. The rain falling in the final days before the 40th was the same rain that had begun on the first day, but its meaning was about to change completely. What had been the instrument of destruction of one world was reaching the end of its judging function, and the following days would inaugurate an entirely different phase of the flood process. Inside the ark, the sounds and sensations of constant rain had become so integral to the daily experience that its eventual cessation may have been felt as a disturbing absence before being recognized as a blessing. 40 nights of continuous and constant sound create a kind of auditory normality whose sudden absence unsettles in a powerful way. The animals inside the ark probably sensed the changes that would precede the end of the rain before the humans could consciously perceive them. Animal sensitivity to variations in atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature, and electromagnetic fields is well documented, and it is reasonable to imagine that the animals aboard the ark showed some behavioral change in the final days of rain. Noah, who certainly paid attention to the behavioral patterns of the animals as part of the daily management of the vessel, may have noticed subtle signs that something was changing, even without fully understanding what those signs meant. Sensitivity to surrounding signs is a characteristic of good leaders and of people who walk attentively under God's guidance in their lives. From the 30th to the 40th day, the magnitude of what had happened to the outside world was impossible to fully comprehend from inside the ark. Noah and his family knew the world had been destroyed, but the actual extent of the transformation happening at the Earth's surface was completely beyond their ability to visualize. Entire civilizations had disappeared, entire geographies had been altered, entire species of animals not on the ark had gone extinct. The world that would exist after the flood would be physically different from the world that had existed before, and Noah would be the only human being to hold any memory of how the world had been before this radical transformation. He carried in his memory a world that no one else had seen and that would never exist again. The 40th day of rain was the last, although those inside the ark could not know that with certainty while it was happening. The biblical text records with simplicity that at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the floodgates of the heavens were closed. This brief phrase closes one of the most dramatic phases in human history, with a sobriety characteristic of biblical narrative. There is no fanfare, no elaborate description of the moment when the last drop fell, only the factual record that the celestial mechanism of destruction was switched off. The end of the rain did not mean the end of the flood, as the waters would still prevail for many months, but it was the beginning of the beginning, the first sign that the phase of destruction had fulfilled its purpose and that the phase of restoration could eventually begin. The day the rain stopped, the silence after the flood. Imagine for a moment what the 41st day inside the ark must have been like. 40 days of uninterrupted rain had created a state of acoustic normality inside the vessel, where the constant sound of water on the roof and around the walls was the permanent soundtrack of all existence within that enclosed space. And then, suddenly, silence. Not total silence, for the animals continued making their sounds, and the movement of the ark in the waters continued producing its creaks and cracks. But the silence of the rain, the absence of the sound that had been ever present for 40 days and 40 nights. That silence must have been at once an immeasurable relief and something profoundly disorienting, a sensory shift that marked the end of an era within the flood experience itself. When the rain stopped, it did not mean the sky cleared or the sun immediately appeared. The clouds that had produced 40 days of unceasing rain likely took time to dissipate, and the external environment remained gloomy and oppressive even without active precipitation. The water level did not drop immediately, and from a practical standpoint, the situation inside and outside the ark on the 41st day was virtually identical to the 40th. The difference was qualitative, not immediately practical. The active instrument of destruction had been switched off, and this represented a theological and spiritual moment of immense importance, even before it had any visible and practical impact on Noah's situation and that of his family. The biblical text tells us that God remembered Noah and all the animals that were with him in the ark. This expression does not mean God had forgotten Noah during the 40 days of rain, but is a biblical way of marking a moment when divine action shifts from one modality to another. God, who had acted as judge during the 40 days, now passed to acting as restorer, and the cessation of rain was the first visible gesture of that transition. The expression that God remembered is used in other crucial moments of the biblical narrative, always marking a turning from judgment to grace, from abandonment to active and protective presence. For Noah, this remembrance of God was the assurance that the purpose for which he had entered the ark would be fulfilled. A wind was made to pass over the earth after the cessation of rain, and the waters began the slow process of receding. This wind is another fascinating detail of the account, suggesting that an active natural mechanism was being used by God to initiate the process of evaporation and draining of the waters. Wind on a global scale, capable of accelerating the evaporation of immense quantities of water, would be a meteorological phenomenon of extraordinary proportions, but consistent with the scale of the entire flood event. It is possible that this wind was perceived inside the ark as a change in the vessel's movement pattern, perhaps a more consistent direction than the random floating of the days of intense rain, a physical sign that something had changed in the system governing the world of the waters. For the 8 survivors inside the ark, the end of the rain brought certainly a mixture of relief and new anxiety. The immediate and obvious danger of the rain had passed, but the objective situation remained uncertain. They were still in the middle of an ocean covering all known land, without knowing when or if they would reach dry ground again. The faith that had sustained them during the 40 days of rain now needed to sustain them for many additional months, as the process of water recession would unfold slowly and invisibly from the interior of the ark. The cessation of rain was an enormous spiritual milestone, but the journey was far from over, and the discipline of continuing to trust in God, even after immediate relief, was the new challenge presenting itself. The silence after the 40 days of rain is also a powerful metaphor about the nature of God's entire judging and restoring process throughout biblical history. God's judgments are not eternal in their intensity, but have defined duration and clear purpose. And when their work is done, they cease, giving way to a phase of reconstruction and restoration. Just as the 40 nights of rain had a beginning and an end defined by God, the periods of tribulation in the lives of individuals and nations within the biblical narrative also have limits that are known to God, even when they are completely obscure to the human beings experiencing them. The 41st day without rain is, in that sense, a theological promise as much as a historical event. The 150 days the waters prevailed. After the rain stopped, the biblical account records that the waters prevailed over the earth for 150 days. This is a period that often receives less attention than the famous 40 days of rain, but which was equally long and equally challenging for the ark's occupants. 150 days is approximately 5 months, and during all that time the waters remained at their maximum level, covering all the earth without any perceptible reduction. The ark floated over a global ocean with no visible shores, with no geographical reference points, with Noah's family living in a floating monotony that tested human endurance in ways the 40 days of rain, for all their dramatic intensity, perhaps did not. During these 150 days, the ark sailed according to currents and winds, without Noah having any control over its direction or destination. There was no rudder, no propulsion, no deliberate navigation. The vessel was simply carried by God's providence over the floodwaters, and Noah needed to trust that this providence would bring it to exactly the right place at the right time. This lack of control is in itself a profound lesson about the nature of biblical faith. There are moments in life when the only thing possible is to be inside the boat God built and allow Him to direct it where it needs to go, without being able to contribute any navigation or control of one's own. The geological transformations that occurred during these 150 days of prevailing waters were probably enormous. The moving water currents over the Earth's surface, the erosive and depositional processes on a global scale, the action of tectonic forces that may have been activated by the massive weight of the water and the rupture of the deep fountains, all of this continued transforming the face of the earth in ways that would only be completely visible when the waters finally receded. The world emerging from the waters would be topographically different from the world that had existed before, with new mountains, new valleys, new ocean basins, and a distribution of continental lands that may have been significantly different from that which existed before the flood. For Noah and his family, each of the 150 days was functionally similar to the others. The tasks of caring for the animals, maintaining the vessel, ensuring the food supply for all, and preserving the physical and mental health of each family member continued with the same demanding regularity. There were no weekends, no days off, no external distraction or entertainment. Life inside the ark was a constant and total discipline, and it is possible that some family members experienced what we now recognize as symptoms of situational depression, caused by prolonged confinement, the loss of everything they had known, and uncertainty about the future. Mental health inside the ark was as real a challenge as physical health. At the end of the 150 days, the Bible records that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. That moment of contact with solid earth, after months of floating on the waters, must have been emotionally extraordinary for all on board. Feeling the structure of the ark stabilize and no longer rock with the movement of the waters, perceiving that there was solid ground beneath the keel, was the first tangible physical confirmation that the process was advancing and that there would be land again. Mount Ararat is located in present-day Turkey, and its identification as the resting place of the Ark has been a source of fascination and archaeological expeditions for centuries, with various historical accounts of people claiming to have seen wooden structures on the mountain slopes. The 150 days of prevailing waters were also a period during which aquatic life, including fish and aquatic organisms, survived and multiplied in the waters covering the earth. The Ark was built to preserve terrestrial life, but the flood was not an event that extinguished all aquatic life. On the contrary, the massive increase in the volume and distribution of the waters may have created favorable conditions for certain forms of marine life, even if the mix of fresh and salt water generated by the combination of rainfall with oceans and underground fountains created challenges for some species. The aquatic biodiversity that survived the flood would be a fundamental part of the new ecosystem that would establish itself when the waters finally receded and dry land emerged again. The signs of the end, the raven and the doves. After the Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat at the end of the 150 days, the process of water recession began gradually and slowly, and Noah needed some way to monitor this process from inside the Ark without being able to go out and personally verify the situation. It was in this context that he used birds as his messengers and sensors, in one of the most poetically rich and theologically profound scenes of the entire flood account. The choice of birds as monitoring instruments was not arbitrary, for birds, with their ability to fly at great heights and to land on any solid surface, were the perfect candidates for verifying whether there was enough dry land to sustain life. The first bird Noah sent was a raven, and this detail is often glossed over in popular discussions of the flood, but deserves careful attention. The raven, a bird that feeds on carrion and is notoriously resilient and opportunistic in its survival needs, was released and kept going back and forth over the waters. There is no record of the raven returning to the Ark, which means it likely found some form of sustenance in the external environment, perhaps feeding on the remains of creatures that had perished in the flood. The raven represented by its very nature a pattern of opportunistic survival that did not depend on the existence of vegetation or clean, dry land, and for this reason, its inability to bring a definitive sign was expected. The dove was Noah's truly informative instrument. In its first release, it returned without finding where to land, indicating the waters still covered all the earth sufficiently to prevent any bird from finding adequate dry soil. Noah waited 7 days before sending it again, a period of patience he had learned to practice over decades of faithful obedience. The second time the dove was sent, it returned carrying a fresh olive branch in its beak, and that simple twig was one of the most powerful messages Noah had received since the beginning of the flood. It was not merely confirmation that there was dry land, but that vegetation was growing again, that life was returning to the earth. The olive branch brought by the dove is one of the most enduring symbols in human history, having crossed millennia to become a universal representation of peace and hope. For Noah, who had lived for months inside an ark over a global ocean of destruction, that small green twig was the most eloquent proof possible that the destructive purpose of the flood had been fulfilled and that a new cycle of life was beginning. The olive tree is a notoriously resilient and long-lived tree, and the fact that green olive branches were already visible at that moment indicates that at least some plants had survived, or that plant regeneration had begun with remarkably swift speed after the waters receded. In the third release of the dove, it did not return, which was the definitive sign that there was dry land and sufficient resources for a bird to sustain itself without needing to return to the refuge of the ark. The absence of the dove's return was, paradoxically, the clearest message of all. There was no longer any need for refuge because the outside world had once again become habitable. But even in the face of this confirmation, Noah did not leave the ark on his own initiative. He waited for God's explicit command to leave, just as he had waited for God's explicit command to enter. This complete obedience, both in entry and in exit, is presented by the biblical text as the model of faith that characterized Noah as a righteous man. He went no further than where God commanded, nor fell short of where God led. Noah's use of birds as sensors of the external environment is a remarkable example of practical wisdom applied within a context of faith. There was no tension between his trust in God and his use of practical means to monitor the situation. The two coexisted in a completely natural way. Noah prayed, and Noah observed, trusted in providence, and used the intelligence God had given him. This integration of faith and practical reason between spiritual dependence and responsible human initiative is one of the most consistent patterns of the biblical narrative when describing the great heroes of faith. The raven and the doves are, in that sense, far more than colorful details of an ancient story. They are windows into the spiritual character of an extraordinary man in a circumstance without parallel in human history. The waters recede and the earth reappears. The process of the flood waters receding was gradual and prolonged, much slower than the flooding process, which had been dramatic and rapid thanks to the intensity of the rain and the bursting of the deep fountains. The biblical text uses the expression that the waters went and decreased, a formulation suggesting a progressive and constant process, not a sudden withdrawal. This is consistent with what we know about natural hydrological processes. Large volumes of water accumulated on a global scale take considerable time to drain, evaporate, and find their new equilibria in aquifers, oceans, and rivers. The patience required of Noah and his family during this final phase of the flood was as great as that which had been required during the 40 days of rain and the 150 days of prevailing waters. As the waters receded, the land that emerged probably presented an appearance radically different from the world that had existed before. Thick layers of sediment deposited by the moving waters covered the ancient landscapes, and geographical contours had been altered in ways that only God could completely map. New forms of erosion had carved ravines and valleys where plains had existed before, and sediment deposits had leveled and covered topographies that existed before the flood. The world emerging from the waters was literally a new world in the most physical and geological sense of the term, not merely metaphorically. It was the same earth, but transformed so radically that the geographical reference points of the antediluvian world were probably unrecognizable. The mountaintops were the first points of land to reappear above the waterline as the waters receded, which is consistent with the basic physics of any receding flood process. After the ark's landing on Ararat at the end of the 150 days, the text records that on the first day of the 10th month, the mountaintops appeared, giving us a precise timeline of the speed of water recession. The appearance of mountaintops was an important visual milestone that allowed Noah to confirm that the restoration process was underway, even though the land was still far from being broadly habitable. Each peak that reappeared was a visual promise that the land was returning, and that God's purpose of repopulating the earth with Noah's family would be fulfilled. The vegetation cover of the earth after the withdrawal of the waters is one of the most fascinating and most discussed aspects of the post-flood period. For the dove to bring a fresh olive branch, vegetation was growing somewhere, but the speed with which plant cover can re-establish itself after a global flood is something that creationist botanists have studied with interest. Some seeds possess extraordinary survival capability even after long periods submerged, and certain types of plants have the ability to regenerate from roots or fragments that may have survived under extreme conditions. The olive tree in particular is known for its resilience and its ability to grow in conditions that would be lethal to most other trees. The world reappearing beneath the receding waters was also a world that would need to be repopulated from scratch. The animals that had survived on the Ark would be the ancestors of all terrestrial fauna that exists today, and the process of dispersal and adaptation that followed the flood is a fascinating field of study for both biogeography and creationist evolutionary biology. How animals reached the continents where we find them today, how species adapted to specific climates got there, and how current genetic diversity could have arisen from a single pair or a few pairs of each original species. These are questions that require both faith and science to be adequately explored. The receding waters were also revealing, layer by layer, the fossil records that later geologists would find and interpret. Trillions of organisms buried rapidly in sediments, preserved in forms so excellent that they allowed detailed reconstruction of extinct species, are for many creationist researchers the clearest geological legacy of the biblical flood. The organization of fossils in sedimentary layers, with marine organisms in the deepest strata and terrestrial ones in the most superficial, is interpreted from this perspective as evidence of a single and global catastrophic event, not of gradual processes over geological ages. The waters that receded were leaving behind a library of stone that would tell the story of the flood for millennia. The day Noah left the ark. God's command for Noah to leave the ark came on the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, which means he had entered the ark at 600 years of age and was leaving it at 601. A full year inside the ark had passed, and now the voice that had commanded the entry commanded the exit. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked outside, and the text tells us that the surface of the ground was dry. That moment of looking outside for the first time, after more than a year of confinement, must have been of an emotional intensity impossible to adequately describe. Seeing the open sky, the dry earth, the sunlight, the wide horizons after months of wooden walls all around was an experience of physical liberation that was certainly accompanied by an avalanche of emotions. The exit from the ark did not happen immediately when Noah removed the covering and saw the dry soil. The biblical text specifies that it was necessary to wait until the second month, the 27th day, for the earth to be completely dry and for God to command the definitive departure. This interval of almost 2 months between seeing the apparently dry soil and receiving the command to leave is another example of Noah's disciplined obedience, who did not act precipitously based on his own observations, but waited for God's confirmation before taking the next step. Human haste is frequently the enemy of God's perfect will, and Noah had learned over decades that God's timing is always the right timing, even when the apparent situation suggests it would already be possible to act sooner. When the command finally came, It was comprehensive and detailed. Noah, his wife, his sons, and his sons' wives were to come out, and they were to bring with them all the animals of all species, so that they might multiply on the earth. The exit from the ark was the reverse of the entry. Just as the animals had entered in providential order, they now came out to repopulate an earth that was literally empty of terrestrial life outside that vessel. The scene of the animals leaving the ark 2 by 2 or in groups, progressively spreading across the newly emerged land from the waters, is one of the most visually powerful in the Bible, and has inspired works of art, literature, and religious imagination for millennia. Noah's first action upon leaving the ark was to build an altar and offer burnt offerings to God from every clean animal species and every clean bird species. This gesture of immediate worship before any provision for himself or his family reveals Noah's spiritual character in eloquent terms. After more than a year inside an ark, with all the privations and challenges that entailed, Noah's first priority was to acknowledge the sovereignty and grace of God that had preserved them. It was not complaint about past suffering, nor anxiety about the uncertain future, but the spontaneous and generous worship of a heart that had found in God its only solid foundation amid the chaos of the waters. God's response to Noah's sacrifice is described with remarkable beauty and intimacy. God smelled the pleasing aroma and resolved in his heart never again to curse the ground on account of man. This unilateral and unconditional promise was the foundation upon which the entire subsequent history of humanity would be built. God acknowledged that the inclination of the human heart was toward evil from youth, the same condition that had precipitated the flood, and yet chose not to destroy all life again as he had done. It was not a change in human nature that motivated this divine decision, but the sovereign grace of God that chose to work with imperfect human beings toward a redemptive purpose that would be fully revealed only in Christ. The departure from the ark marked the beginning of a new era for humanity, characterized by a covenant God established with Noah and with all of creation. The rainbow in the sky, presented as the sign of this covenant, was not merely a beautiful meteorological phenomenon, but a symbol laden with profound theological meaning. It was the promise that the floodgates of heaven would not be opened again to destroy the earth in the same way, that the seasons would be maintained in a reliable fashion, that the order of creation would be preserved as long as the earth existed. For Noah and his family, who had seen the world destroyed once, and who certainly lived with the awareness that it could happen again, the rainbow was literally the promise that made the future possible, to live without the paralyzing weight of fear. The eternal meaning of the 40 days of rain. The 40 days of rain of the flood are not merely an isolated historical event, but form part of a numerical and thematic pattern that runs throughout the entire Bible in a consistent and significant manner. The number 40 appears repeatedly at moments of trial, transformation, and spiritual preparation. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before being called. Israel wandered for 40 years in the wilderness before entering the promised land. Elijah walked 40 days to Mount Horeb. Jesus fasted 40 days in the desert before beginning his public ministry. In all these cases, the period of 40 functions as a time of purification, of emptying the old so that the new can emerge, of preparation for a mission that could not be accomplished without that specific period of formation. The rain that lasted 40 days can also be seen as a kind of baptism on a cosmic scale, a reading that Peter himself suggests in his first letter when he compares the flood to Christian baptism. Just as the flood waters destroyed the corrupt world and preserved Noah in a completely renewed environment, the waters of baptism symbolize the death of the old human being corrupted by sin and the emergence of a new creature in Christ. Biblical baptism is not merely a religious ceremony, but the visible sign of a real transformation that mirrors, on an individual scale, what the flood did on a global scale. Water, which in the flood was the instrument of both judgment and preservation, becomes in baptism the symbol of death and resurrection, of ending and beginning. Jesus used the days of Noah as an analogy to describe the conditions that will prevail on earth shortly before his second coming. Just as people in Noah's time were completely absorbed in the activities of daily life without any awareness that judgment was imminent, Jesus affirmed that the same condition of spiritual indifference would characterize the generation alive at the time of his return. The implicit message is that those who are attentive to God's word, as Noah was, will be prepared, while those who live only for immediate interests and disregard prophetic warning will be caught off guard, just as the generation of the flood was. The flood is not merely history, it is prophecy. The pattern of destruction, followed by new creation that the flood establishes, is an archetype that repeats at different scales throughout the entire biblical narrative and points toward the final renewal of all creation described in the book of Revelation. The Apostle Peter writes that just as the ancient world was destroyed by waters, the present world is being kept by fire for the day of judgment. The theological logic is the same. A corrupted world cannot simply be reformed from within, but must pass through a process of purification that makes way for a new and radical creation. The flood was the first great act of recreation in biblical history, and the final renewal of all the heavens and all the earth will be the last and definitive act of the same redemptive sequence. For the contemporary believer, the 40 days of rain communicate truths about the nature of God that are as relevant today as they were for Noah. The holiness of God that cannot coexist indefinitely with widespread moral corruption. The grace of God that preserves the righteous even amid the judgment of the wicked. The faithfulness of God that fulfills every promise it makes within every deadline it establishes, and the sovereignty of God that directs even the most chaotic events toward his redemptive purposes. All these truths are vivid and present in the account of the 40 days of rain. Studying the flood with attention and seriousness is not merely an exercise in historical or scientific interest, but an encounter with the character of God revealed in action at one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. The legacy of the 40 days of rain lives in every rainbow that appears in the sky after a storm, reminding humanity of a promise made to a single man on a vessel over a global ocean millennia ago. It lives in the flood stories preserved in virtually all cultures of the world, memories echoing across generations of an event that no civilization descended from it could completely forget. It lives in Christian theology that sees in the flood a prefiguration of baptism, and in the rainbow a prefiguration of the covenant sealed by the blood of Christ. And it lives in the conviction of faith that the God who closed the door of Noah's ark with his own hand is the same God who opens the doors of his grace to all who, like Noah, seek to walk with him in obedience and faithfulness, regardless of what the world around them may think or do.